Hi class. So we'll start with a review of what happened last time. You should have watched these videos from CS61A. That's UC Berkeley's introductory programming class that goes over everything we've talked about in object-oriented programming. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 of those videos. And you should have read about the init method, which is short for initialization. This special method gets called when an object is first created. Last semester we called this the constructor. You often hear me say constructor versus init or initialization. You want to pay attention to the syntax here. It's 2 underscores, the word init in it, followed by another 2 set of underscores, and this is a Python thing. So the constructor or the init method would look like this for the time class. In JavaScript, use the constructor keyword and everything else looks pretty much the same. Self is replaced with the keyword this. And it's common for the parameters of init to have the same names as the attributes. So notice here you have hours, hour, minute, and second. So this first line here, self.hour equals hour, stores the value of the parameter hour into an attribute of self. But you'll notice parameters are optional. We've been doing this first line, time equals time with parentheses next to it, like since the very beginning. So if we call time with no arguments, you get the default values, which are denoted here. I think this is the first instance we're seeing of the equal sign being put into the arguments. Those are its default values. If you just have one argument, for example the first one, then it overrides the hour, hours equals 9, and the rest becomes 0 and 0, minutes and seconds. If you give it 2 numbers, the first 2 things are overridden, or overwritten. Hour was 9, minute is 45, so that gets saved there. Seconds remain 0. And if you call it 3 arguments, and then all 3 values here are overwritten. 0, default of 0 got overwritten to 9, default of 0 for minutes became 45, default of 0 for second became 31. Other special method that's very useful is the str method, which is short for string, underscore underscore str underscore underscore. It is the string version for an object. And for this specific special method, it is what's called when the print method is called for your objects. And you'll notice this is very familiar. This line of code was from print time from earlier. And now you can, instead of calling print time, you can use Python's built-in print method, and it knows to go look at the underscore string function, or this special method, underscore underscore str underscore underscore, and it can print it out. This method is very handy for debugging. So when you're first making objects, you should make a constructor. I need to fix the I there, init, and for debugging, you write the string method for each class. Init. And then you did a bunch of practice quiz questions. And there was the key. The next new topic is continuing on this idea of special methods. We talk about operator overloading. So operators are like your plus, your minus, your comparison, double equals, less than, greater than. The dot even counts as an operator, and there's a bunch more, but those are the common ones. So we can change the behaviors for those operators. Like when you do traditional addition, you have an integer, like 4 plus 5, that's like an integer plus an integer. You could change that to be something wacky, and suddenly integer operation addition isn't what you think it is. Like you can map addition into subtraction, subtraction into multiplication, so on and so forth. You have that ability in Python. But in a more practical sense, let's say you wanted to add two time objects and you wanted to use the plus sign. Well, then you have to override the um, under the add method. So that looks like this. By default, like Python already knows how to add 4 plus 5. But adding a time plus a time object, Python doesn't know how to do that, which is why you have to define this function. Tell it what it means to add two times together. So this part should look familiar. That was like add time or function we had. We turned them into integers, and then we turned those integers back into time from earlier. So now we're putting it here, and this is the special name, underscore underscore add. And then this line right here, the print, this first part, inside the parentheses, that's going to be two time objects, right? Start and duration. They're being added together. Python now knows how to do that. It'll look here. Once that's done, notice here a number is returned. No, a time object is returned into time. So then it calls the underscore underscore str underscore underscore method. A reminder about these parameters. Self is the first one, okay, and then this is the other is the second. Sometimes you often won't see the self there. You only, or I'll have next example reminding you of how self, these are arguments work for objects. So there's a bunch of other ones, and this process of telling Python, telling the programming language how certain operators work for different objects is called operator overloading. And here's a list of ones that are useful. The comparison operators, like what does it mean to be greater than or is after? Suddenly you can override like what does it mean for a time to be less than time? It occurs before it. What does it mean for a time to be greater than a time? Then it means to be after it. You can use operators to work with your objects instead of typing in functions like is, end, after, start. And you can go to this link to look up a bunch more. So dispatching, type-based dispatching. So dispatch is like what happens when you call like 911. The emergency dispatcher will talk to you and think about, okay, what kind of issue, problem do you have, and they'll connect you to the appropriate emergency service, right? Same thing with type-based dispatching in a programming language. Let's say you give Python a time object plus a time object. Great, it knows how to handle that. But what happens if you give Python a time object and an integer? Suddenly you want to add on that number of hours, for example, right? But it's given to you in an integer form. Python won't know how to handle that because the second case of time plus an integer, you haven't defined that just yet. So we add in a line into the underscore underscore add underscore underscore method, and there it's going to check. Okay, it's going to check what is your second argument. You already have a time object, and now what do you want to add to it? If it's another time object, then you're going to add time plus time. But if it's not, then it assumes, okay, you have an integer coming up. So that means you're going to call the increment function and progress it on by that set amount of like seconds. I misspoke earlier when I said hours. It's number of seconds. So this action, right, checking your types beforehand and more importantly, like having the same name for it, the addition symbol, right, that's called type-based dispatching. So both this line here and this line over here work, right? Because the same plus operator is being used. It knows how to handle time plus time object and time plus an integer. And we can do it longer. Maybe you want to give it a double, right? A decimal of some sort, and suddenly that's like seconds afterwards. Seconds, and then go into like milliseconds or whatever a hundredth of a second is, the formal name. You can handle that. And all of it works with this same plus operator. So this plus operator plays the role of like the dispatcher. It checks, okay, do I have two time objects or do I have a time object and something else? So based on the types, it knows how to call different methods. It can handle that. But you'll notice for these, like the addition symbol, when in most programming languages, it's not commutative. You can't switch the order of these things. So in math, the commutative property is like, okay, 4 plus 5 is the same as 5 plus 4. Doesn't matter if the 4 or the 5 comes first. But when you're programming, it does matter what comes first. So in this case, notice this line, we switched the order from before. It was start plus 1337. Now 1337 came first, and you're trying to add start, and it gives you this error. Int and instance. Instance is your custom made type. So the problem is, instead of asking the time object to add an integer, Python is asking the integer, like that built-in class, the type, like the integer class, to add a time object, and it doesn't know how. So to get around that issue, in Python, there's a special write add method, and that's this special method, underscore underscore r add, R-A-D-D, underscore underscore. That thing handles this case where a time object appears on the right side of an operator. So notice here, this is the example I mentioned earlier, right? By defining write add self and other, self here, underscore underscore add other, right? So with write add, it looks at, okay, here is your object, there is your integer. Once that thing is identified, it knows that, okay, this is on the right, so that's your self. And then it thinks, okay, this is what you're going to add, your other. This thing is going to add here, recognizing that it is a time object, add on this number of seconds. So it's integer, it's time integer addition. So we'll call the increment function. As, like, here's the complicated part. That was a bad explanation. So like this thing, add, remember self is the first argument. Other is the second argument. So when we go back here, self is your time, other is your integer. So that means it goes back here, goes to else, and then calls this line. Like it switches the order of these two things. So as an exercise, you can write the add method for the point class. A point has an x coordinate and a y coordinate. Think about how you would handle it when trying to overload the add method when you're given a tuple and your custom defined type or programmer defined type object of a point. Try to handle those cases. The answer's on this slide, and that is today's lecture. Oh, forgot to mention, these later ideas, right? Computer programming A, there's no JavaScript equivalent, so you can not care about this one, but conceptually, it might be interesting for you all. But there is no operator overloading or type-based dispatching in JavaScript.